Just a floor nurse. That was what Dr. Sterling said when he walked past the medication cart, his voice pitched loud enough for the Mitchells to hear. His shoes, Italian leather, probably cost more than Natalie Hayes earned in a week, clicked against the tile floor of Oak Creek Memorial's pediatric wing. The morning light filtered through the corridor windows, and he didn't even glance at the chart she'd just updated. Didn't acknowledge the notations about pain management protocols or the vital sign trend she'd been tracking. Just that dismissive laugh, the kind that made the other nurses exchange glances. They didn't know. Natalie kept her pen moving across the documentation, her hand steady as surgical steel. Her scrubs were standard issue blue, wrinkled at the hem where she'd walked through the rain that morning. Her hair was pulled back so tight it looked like it might hurt. Her badge clipped to her pocket read N. Hayes, RN, in letters too small for anyone to actually read unless they leaned in. And nobody leaned in. Not anymore. The nurses around her, 3 of them clustered near the supply station, had learned that when Natalie sat down for lunch, it was time for them to leave. She'd been walking these corridors for 4 years now, ever since she'd moved to Portland and decided to disappear. The thing about invisibility is that you have to practice it. You have to be intentional about the way you move through a space, shoulders slightly forward, eyes down but not closed, breathing shallow so you take up less air. You walk the outer edges of hallways instead of down the center. You eat your lunch in the break room but in the corner, back to the wall, positioned so you could see anyone approaching from 3 angles. Muscle memory from Helmand Province. Old habits. Habits that kept you alive in places where being seen was the same thing as being marked. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that constant droning sound that never quite stopped, never quite became silent. It was the soundtrack of hospital life, just underneath everything. Beeping monitors, squeaking stretchers, the pneumatic hiss of automatic doors, but always, always that hum. After 4 years, Natalie barely registered it anymore. Her brain had learned to filter it out the same way she'd learned to filter out the sound of helicopters landing in distant places. The way she'd learned to filter out a lot of things. She traced the spine of the chart in front of her, her eyes moving across the vital signs from the day shift. 7-year-old with pneumonia, responding well to antibiotics. 12-year-old post-appendectomy, clear lungs, pain controlled. 9-year-old with acute leukemia, counts dropping, labs ordered. She knew every child on this floor the way some people knew their own children, knew their favorite television shows, their juice preferences, which nurses made them cry and which ones made them laugh. She knew that Marcus in 412 wanted his blanket folded with the corner tucked under his chin, and that Sophie in 408 needed exactly 17 minutes of quiet time after medication administration before she could talk. Dr. Sterling knew their diagnoses. He probably didn't know any of their names without checking the chart. The automatic doors at the end of the corridor hissed open. Natalie heard it, that pneumatic sigh of hydraulics releasing, and her pen stilled for just a fraction of a second. Something in her posture shifted. Not her face. Her face remained composed, professionally neutral, the expression she'd perfected over 20 years of operations where your face could cost you tactical advantage. But her shoulders squared maybe an inch, and her left hand moved to the edge of the desk, positioning her weight slightly forward. A man in dress whites walked through the doors, and behind him, a wheelchair. The man was tall, late 40s, with the kind of bearing that comes from carrying rank through fire and keeping it. His uniform was pressed to knife-edge precision. His shoes were polished to mirrors. But what Natalie saw first, what her eyes locked onto with the precision of a tactical spotter marking a target, was the scar above his left eye. A thin line, maybe 2 inches long, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. Unless you'd stitched it yourself in the dark, your hand shaking not from fear but from adrenaline, in a field hospital somewhere in Helmand Province. 20 years ago. She watched him wheel the chair forward, carefully, deliberately, like he was navigating a minefield, and she saw the boy. Wheelchair-bound, legs motionless beneath a blanket, maybe 9 or 10 years old. Face pale but alert, eyes moving around the corridor with the kind of intensity kids got when they were trying to figure out if they were in more danger or less danger than before. The boy's father kept one hand on the chair's push handle, and with the other he was running his fingers through his hair, a gesture that spoke volumes about desperation and sleepless nights and the particular kind of terror that comes when your child's body stops working. Natalie set her pen down. Not slowly. Not with any drama. Just set it down like it was a neutral action, like she wasn't suddenly aware of her own breathing, wasn't suddenly calculating distance and angles and the precise moment when recognition becomes irreversible. The boy in the wheelchair was not the same 5-year-old she'd pulled from a burning vehicle 2 decades ago. That child had been screaming, covered in soot, one arm hanging wrong. This was a different person entirely, shaped by different fire. But the man was unmistakable. Commander Garrett Mitchell. She'd seen his name in a newspaper article once, 8 months ago. Naval Special Warfare Command. Decorated SEAL Officer. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Multiple deployments. She'd read it the way you read an obituary for someone you used to know, with a kind of distant acknowledgement that their life had continued in a trajectory parallel to yours, 2 paths that had intersected once in chaos and then diverged into completely different futures. She hadn't expected those paths to collide again. The boy, Tyler, she thought, though she didn't yet know his name, wheeled past the nurse's station. His hands gripped the wheels with surprising strength. He was trying to push himself, she noted. Fighting to maintain independence even at 10 years old, even with legs that didn't work. She recognized that impulse. She'd seen it before in soldiers trying to stand after IED explosions, trying to prove to themselves that their bodies still belong to them. "We have an appointment with pediatric neurology," the commander said. His voice was different from what she'd imagined, softer than she expected, but with an undercurrent of something sharp. Not aggression. Command presence. The voice of someone accustomed to having people listen. That would be Dr. Sterling, one of the other nurses offered, already moving. "I'll let him know you're here." Natalie didn't move. She continued processing the charts in front of her, her pen moving in neat notations, times, observations, protocol adherence. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. There was no tremor in her fingers, no flush of emotion across her face. This was what 20 years of discipline looked like. This was what happened when you'd learned to compartmentalize shock the way soldiers compartmentalize fear. You filed it away. You noted the data points. You continued with the task at hand. But her eyes tracked them as they moved down the corridor. Watched the boy trying to position his chair. Watched the commander's hand tighten on the push handle, his jaw clenching like he was holding something back, not anger, she thought, but something closer to anguish. The specific anguish of a parent watching a child suffer. The thing about invisibility is that nobody notices when you see them. They assumed they were invisible to you as well. Dr. Sterling emerged from his office with his phone in one hand and his manner in the other, the kind of manner that announced his presence before his voice did. He was tall, built like someone who did tennis instead of running, with features that belonged in a country club rather than a hospital. His watch caught the fluorescent light and threw a prismatic gleam across the corridor. His tie was silk. His shoes were genuinely Italian, not just aspirationally so. He looked at Tyler in the wheelchair the way someone might look at a challenging piece of paperwork. "Commander Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "I've reviewed the imaging. Tragic situation. Degenerative spinal column disease, yes? Relatively rare in pediatric presentations." Natalie watched from the documentation desk. Watched the commander shake his hand. Watched Sterling's eyes move to the chart one of the nurses had already prepared for him, 48 hours of medical history distilled into lab values and imaging results and diagnostic codes. "We've been to 6 specialists in the last 2 months, the commander said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the edges of it. "Nobody has a treatment plan. Nobody has anything beyond prognosis. I was told you specialize in complex pediatric spinal cases." "I do," Sterling said. He was already scanning the chart, his eyes moving with practice speed across the data. "Though I have to say, Some of the clinical decisions made in your previous workups are somewhat questionable, particularly regarding the conservative management approach you've been pursuing. Has anyone discussed more aggressive interventions? Such as, there's a cutting-edge facility in the Cayman Islands. Platelet-rich plasma injections into the lesion site, combined with spinal cord stem cell therapy. 34% success rate in early trials. Not approved here in the States yet, but we have partnerships with facilities that are operating under compassionate use protocols. Natalie's pen stopped moving. She watched Sterling guide the Mitchells toward his office, still talking about protocols and partnerships and cutting-edge medicine. She watched the commander's shoulders relax slightly, the posture of a man who'd finally found someone offering hope, however expensive that hope might be. She watched the automatic doors hiss open ahead of them and then close, cutting off the conversation. And then she returned to her documentation. Because that was what you did when you were invisible. You kept doing your job. You kept your observations to yourself. You didn't intercede. You didn't offer opinion. You were just a floor nurse doing floor nurse work, and nobody expected anything more from you. That was what the other nurses assumed, anyway. The chart she was updating belonged to a 6-year-old with acute respiratory distress. She'd been monitoring the boy's oxygen saturation trajectory, his ventilation patterns, his blood gas values from that morning's lab drawer. She'd noticed something the shift report had glossed over, a subtle downward trend in his partial pressure of oxygen, the kind of trend that doesn't matter if you're not paying attention but becomes very important if you are. She'd noted it. She'd flagged it for the day shift physician. She'd done her job with the precision of someone trained to assess systems and predict failure points. Because that's what she'd been trained to do. The humming of the fluorescent light seemed louder now, or maybe she was just more aware of it. The automatic doors hissed open and closed, as staff moved through the corridors. Monitors beeped in patient rooms. The pneumatic hiss of the respiratory system echoed from the PQ down the hall. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something organic and slightly wrong, the smell of sickness, of bodies not functioning correctly, of medicine trying to push back against entropy. Natalie kept her pen moving. She kept her eyes on her work. She kept her back to the wall and her breath controlled and her face composed. She was invisible in the way she'd learned to be invisible, and she would remain invisible for as long as possible. But she'd seen the scar. And she'd recognized it. And somewhere in the precise, controlled, absolutely disciplined part of her mind, something had shifted. Not obviously. Not visibly. But shifted nonetheless, the way a weapon shifts when you chamber a round, the way the air shifts when a storm is gathering on the horizon, the way the world shifts when two trajectories that had diverged 20 years ago suddenly collide again. Dr. Sterling swept into room 304 with the kind of entrance that required an audience, and he had one, Commander Garrett Mitchell leaning against the wall with the exhausted posture of a man who'd spent 48 hours searching for a miracle. The folder in Sterling's hand opened with a crisp snap, papers fanned like a magician's trick. Tyler's chart. Tyler's X-rays. Tyler's diagnosis, now Sterling's opportunity. Commander, these scans are remarkable, Sterling said, his voice coated in the false sympathy of someone performing concern. Degenerative spinal condition, T7 through T9 involvement, progressive motor loss, I've reviewed your consultations. 6 specialists offering nothing but comfort care. He paused, letting that word hang like a funeral bell. Comfort care. The surrender word. That's because they're working within conventional parameters. I'm not. Mitchell's jaw tightened. What are you saying? Natalie entered with the afternoon medications, the routine part of her day, the invisible part, the part where she belonged in doorways with pill cups instead of conversation. She stopped at the lightboard where Tyler's spine glowed in shades of white and gray, her eyes tracking the vertebral bodies, the narrowing spaces, the story the imaging told. One measured breath. Then she moved forward. Dr. Sterling, the T7, T9 presentation suggests anterior decompression with. Sterling's laugh cut through her like a knife through silk. Not a real laugh. A performance. His head turned toward Mitchell with theatrical slowness, his expression the careful arrangement of a man about to dismantle someone's credibility in 17 words. Tyler's dad, let me apologize for Nurse Hayes here. Each word polished, deliberate, the voice of institutional authority speaking to institutional authority. She's got some community college courses, works the floor, does the vitals. Real medicine, though, that's what we're doing in my department. The real doctors are talking. He turned his back to her with the precision of a choreographed insult, his body language a door slamming in her face. His hand gestured toward the chair beside Mitchell's. An invitation. A belonging. Everything Natalie wasn't. Mitchell's eyes flickered, confusion blooming across his features like ink in water. He'd been desperate. He'd been grateful. Now he was wondering if he'd been trusting the wrong person. Natalie took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened so hard it ached. The single tear that escaped didn't crack her composure, she simply wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling, her hand steady as the hand that had once held a tourniquet on a lance corporal's femoral artery while mortar rounds screamed overhead. She didn't flinch. Didn't retreat. Didn't tremble. When she spoke, her voice dropped half an octave, and 20 years of combat training burned through every syllable like a laser through fog. I've triaged combat wounds in the dark, I don't make medication errors. Sterling didn't even turn around. He pivoted back to Mitchell as if Natalie had already left the room, was already forgotten, was already a floor nurse who'd spoken out of turn. He pulled a folder from his jacket, glossy brochure, pristine as a magazine cover. Salzburg Clinic in Costa Rica. Cutting-edge regenerative protocols. Stem cell therapy. Spinal cord stimulation technology that won't be FDA approved in the US for another 5, maybe 10 years. How much? Mitchell asked. Your son's mobility? His future? His independence? Sterling's smile was a predator's smile. We're looking at $275,000 for the initial protocol. But that's an investment in Tyler's life. He paused, letting the number settle like sediment. Of course, my referral fee is only 6 figures per patient. Insurance doesn't cover it, so it comes from my private consulting contract with the clinic. Just wanted to be transparent. Mitchell's expression shifted. A man hearing the price tag on his desperation. A man calculating sacrifice. Natalie stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds, watching Sterling lean closer to Mitchell like a friend sharing secrets, watching the commander's shoulders sag under the weight of hope being repackaged as commerce. She left without a word. That was stage 2 of her invisibility, the part where she learned to disappear not just physically but professionally, where each interaction reinforced the narrative that her words didn't matter, her experience didn't exist, her presence was something to tolerate between more important conversations. The break room at 1,145 hours was a fluorescent purgatory, beige walls holding the sediment of 10,000 shifts and the accumulated weight of every nurse who'd ever needed 30 minutes to pretend the next 6 hours weren't coming. Natalie sat at the small table by the window with her lunch, the same rice and vegetables she'd brought 5 days in a row, stretched across her budget because her rent was climbing and her savings were a depleting well. The rice was cold. The vegetables had the texture of something that had surrendered to time. For nurses sat at the corner table, the constellation of younger staff who'd started after her, who'd learned their practice from templates that didn't include what Natalie carried. She heard the first one before she saw the gesture. Did you see her try to diagnose? The voice was loud enough to be heard, soft enough to claim innocence if called out. Like she went to med school instead of community college. Sterling shut that down fast. The second nurse laughed, a sound like ice cracking. She thinks she knows more than the doctors. The third one stood, and the others followed, a choreography of dismissal. They left their trash on the table, a crumpled napkin, a yogurt container with a spoon still in it, a cup with lipstick stains on the rim. All the small detritus of belonging to a group that didn't include her. Natalie watched them file toward the door without looking at her, watched the space where they'd been compressed and close like a wound healing over a foreign object. She ate methodically. 1 bite. Pause. 1 bite. The rice moved from plate to mouth to stomach in the same mechanical sequence her therapist had taught her, the grounding technique for when your nervous system decided it was still in Helmand Province and the fluorescent lights were more to fire. Count the breaths. Feel the texture of the food. Name 5 things you can see: window, clock, trash can, exit sign, the edge of her own hand on the plastic fork. By 14:30 hours, everyone at Oak Creek Memorial who passed the main nurses' station could see it, a document printed in black ink and highlighted in neon yellow, pinned to the cork board where schedule changes and continuing education credits and shift swap requests lived. Natalie's name at the top. A disciplinary write-up. The kind of official document that lived in personnel files forever, that followed you to job interviews, that whispered in the background every time someone's trust was supposed to be automatic but wasn't. 3 medication errors. Documented. Investigated. Substantiated. Natalie had made none of them. She'd never made a medication error in her career, not in combat medicine with one hand holding pressure on an artery and the other pushing drugs into someone who was seconds from exsanguinating, not in a civilian hospital with protocols and time and all the luxury of doing things right. But the document didn't require that she'd actually committed the errors. It only required that Dr. Sterling's signature appeared at the bottom, that his authority had turned her competence into negligence in the time it took to type and print. The charge nurse walked past without making eye contact. That was a message. The resident Natalie had trained 3 months ago whispered sorry from across the station without breaking stride. That was another message. By 1500 hours, the messages had led into a wall, and Natalie stood at the nurse's station holding a pen, reading her own name in someone else's lie, and her hand trembled only when she reached for the acknowledgement line. Not from fear. Not from grief. From restraint. From the terrible clarity of knowing exactly what was happening and choosing not to respond the way her training had prepared her to respond. Sterling's office door was closed, but she could feel him watching through the glass, could feel his satisfaction like heat radiating from a fire. He was making a call. She could see the phone pressed to his ear, his voice moving in inaudible sentences, his web of authority expanding like a spider's web, and she was the fly that had made the mistake of being visible. One measured breath. Then another. The pen signed the acknowledgement. Natalie Hayes acknowledged the errors that weren't hers, the diagnosis that was someone else's decision, the humiliation that had public witnesses and a timestamp and an official record that would follow her like a shadow. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened when night shift came and the hospital shifted into its darker rhythms, when visiting hours ended and the real work began in the space between dusk and dawn where no one had been expecting anything would change. The O200 check was routine. Natalie moved through the ICU corridor with the practiced silence of someone who had learned to be a ghost, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the tile. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from room for 12, steady and reliable. She pushed open the door with 2 fingers, keeping the movement gentle so the hinges wouldn't creak. Tyler was sleeping, his small frame barely visible under the hospital blanket, his chest rising and falling with the assisted breath of the machine. The boy's father sat in the visitor's chair beside him, Commander Garrett Mitchell's head tilted back against the wall, his jaw slack in exhausted sleep. Even unconscious, his posture held military precision, shoulders squared, one hand resting on the armrest like he might have to move at any second. Natalie had seen that kind of readiness before. She'd lived in that state for 20 years. She checked the 4 line first. Saline flowing smooth, no infiltration. Ventilator setting stable. O2 sat reading 94 on the monitor, solid. The chest X-ray from 4 hours ago was taped to the light box, lungs clear, no effusion, no pneumothorax. Tyler's paralysis made him vulnerable to aspiration, but tonight he was breathing fine. The medication was working. The boy was stable. Natalie made a note in the chart and turned to leave. She was halfway to the door when Tyler's breathing changed. It wasn't subtle. It was wrong. The change happened between one breath and the next, sudden, sharp, laboured. The ventilator tried to deliver the next breath and met resistance, the machine's pressure climbing higher, alarming softly. Natalie's head snapped back. Her hands moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory taking over like it always did. She was at the bedside in 3 steps. Tyler's chest was asymmetrical. The left side wasn't rising with the right. His O2 sat plummeted from 94 to 87 in the space of seconds. His heart rate spiked to 142. The skin around his neck was starting to show that subtle venous distension that meant pressure was building inside his chest cavity, air where it shouldn't be, collapsing the lung like a fist closing. Tension pneumothorax. She'd seen this before. In a burning Humvee outside Sanjin Valley with rounds cracking overhead and her hand shaking from adrenaline, not fear. She'd seen a Marine sergeant's chest cave in like someone had scooped out his lungs, and she'd known he had minutes, maybe less, before his heart stopped. She'd done this exact procedure on a stretcher at 30 miles an hour, no light except a red combat lantern, and the man had lived. The man was probably still alive right now, probably had kids of his own, probably never knew that some floor nurse in Portland had once saved his life in the dark. Natalie didn't hesitate. She didn't call out. She moved. She grabbed the emergency crash cart with one hand, yanked open the equipment drawer with the other, and her fingers found what she needed without thinking. 14-gauge needle. 2 inches long. She swabbed Tyler's skin with antiseptic in a circle the size of a golf ball, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the landmark burned into her muscle memory like a tattoo. The alcohol smell filled the small space between them, sharp and chemical. The on-call resident, Dr. Kapoor, stumbled into the room behind her, still pulling on his stethoscope. He was young, maybe 30, with a disoriented expression of someone pulled from sleep. He saw Tyler's monitor. He froze. Natalie didn't. She pressed the needle through skin and muscle and fascia in one smooth motion. The hiss came immediately, a long, pressurized release of air escaping from the space around Tyler's lung. The sound of a pressure seal breaking. The sound of relief. "Get me a 16-gauge catheter for the chest tube placement," she said without looking up. Dr. Kapoor didn't move. "Now, doctor." The needle came out. The catheter went in, and she secured it with trembling hands. No, not trembling. Precise. Controlled. The kind of trembling that was actually the steady grip of someone whose nervous system had been recalibrated by combat into a state of perfect functional clarity. The trembling was restraint. The trembling was everything she knew held inside a frame of absolute calm. Tyler's oxygen saturation started climbing. 87. 90. 95. His heart rate dropped from 142 to 118. His breathing, still machine-assisted, became synchronized again. The asymmetry in his chest resolved like someone had turned a dial. The resident finally moved, fumbling for the crash cart, and Natalie was already calling the night supervisor, her voice level and controlled. Room for 12. Tension pneumothorax. Decompression complete. Need chest tube placement at bedside, now. I'm staying until it's in. Commander Mitchell woke suddenly, his body responding to the coded language of crisis the way military men's bodies always did. His hand went to his son's shoulder, checking for movement, for breathing, for life. His eyes found Natalie's across the small room, and for one moment she saw something cross his face, recognition, not of who she was now, but of what she was doing. The kind of recognition that only comes when you've watched someone operate under pressure and understood, in that instant, that you were watching someone practiced. Someone trained. Someone who had done this before, and would do it again, and would do it right. "He's stable," Natalie said, and her voice had dropped an octave. The nurse was gone. What remained was something older and harder and infinitely more certain. "He's going to be fine." The next 30 seconds blurred, Dr. Kapoor finally engaged, the night supervisor arriving with the crash cart, the thoracotomy tray opening with the whisper of sterile packaging. Natalie guided the tube placement with 2-word commands that weren't questions: tray up. Retractor. Clamp. There. The tube went in, the hiss of air released again, and Tyler's lungs fully re-inflated on the monitor, his O2 sat climbing to 97, staying there, holding. Stable. Viable. Alive. The resident looked at Natalie with an expression that might have been awe or might have been shock or might have been the beginning of understanding that he had just watched a floor nurse perform an emergency life-saving procedure with the kind of precision he'd only read about in surgical journals. He didn't speak. Smart choice. Dr. Sterling arrived 7 minutes later, his face purple the way faces got when blood pressure spiked fast and angry. He took in the scene, the secured catheter, the X-ray pulled up on the monitor showing the resolved pneumothorax, the resident standing useless near the corner, Natalie's hand on Tyler's monitor, steady as a heartbeat. Sterling didn't ask what had happened. He already knew. The on-call resident would have called him. The supervisor would have called him. The emergency alert would have gone straight to his phone. What he was looking at was the evidence that Natalie Hayes had just saved his meal ticket. The boy he'd been planning to transfer to an offshore clinic at $200,000 per treatment was now alive and recovering from an emergency complication, and it wasn't because of Sterling's referral network or his golfing buddies or his pharmaceutical connections. It was because of her. His jaw clenched so hard his temples visibly pulsed. He didn't speak to Natalie. Didn't look at her. Instead, he turned to the resident and his voice came out quiet, controlled, and infinitely more dangerous than any yelling could have been. Dr. Kapoor. My office. Now. Then, to the night supervisor, Natalie Hayes is relieved of duty effective immediately. Badge access revoked. She does not enter this unit again. She does not have contact with Commander Mitchell or any member of his family. Is that clear? The supervisor's face went pale. She nodded. Sterling walked out. Dr. Kapoor followed like a man being led to an execution. Natalie stood beside Tyler's bed for exactly 3 seconds, her hand still on the monitor. She could feel Commander Mitchell's eyes on her, the weight of his attention like a physical pressure. She could feel the supervisor waiting for her to react, to speak, to do something. She could feel the ICU around her, the machines and the fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell, all of it suddenly foreign in a way it had never been, even during the worst of Helmand Province, even during the years when she was operating on combat adrenaline and prayers and the knowledge that one mistake meant someone's kid wouldn't come home. She looked at Tyler once more. The boy's O2 sat was solid. His heart rate was normal. His breathing was synchronized with the ventilator. He would sleep now. He would recover. He would live, which meant Mitchell would get to keep his son, and that mattered more than anything Sterling could take from her. He's stable, she said quietly. Watch the pressure readings. If the catheter starts showing resistance, call the ICU attending. Don't wait. She said it to the supervisor, but she was looking at Commander Mitchell. Then she turned and walked out of the room, her movements deliberate and unhurried, her back straight, her composure intact. Behind her, she could hear Sterling's voice on a phone in the hallway, already dialing, already moving, already activating whatever network of board members and golf buddies and referral partners he'd cultivated over years of whispered favors and convenient silence. I need to speak to several people, Sterling was saying. Ms. Hayes violated protocol tonight. I have a situation that requires immediate administrative attention. Natalie walked past him without breaking stride. Her badge was still clipped to her scrubs. It would be gone by dawn. Sterling moved through the hospital corridors that morning like a man assembling ammunition. His phone was already to his ear before he reached his office, his voice steady, practiced, the voice of someone who knew exactly which doors to open and which people owed him favors. The board members answered on the first ring. They always did. 17 years of golf outings at Waverley Country Club. 18 holes every other Saturday. A case of single malt scotch at Christmas. A referral network that kept their private practices profitable. Sterling had built those relationships the way a mason builds walls, one brick, one handshake, one quiet understanding at a time. It's a liability issue, he said into the phone, his voice smooth as oil. The nurse who performed that emergency procedure last night. No authorization. No consultation with attending. We need to move fast before this becomes a patient safety lawsuit we're defending. He paused, listening. Her employment history is sparse. Very sparse. I want it looked at. I want to know where she's been for the last decade. I want it done by end of day. Another pause. His smile was invisible but audible. I appreciate your discretion on this. The Foundation's annual donation has always supported the board's initiatives, hasn't it? By noon, an investigator was in Sterling's office. Clean suit. Efficient manner. The kind of man who asked questions and didn't care about the answers as long as the invoice got paid. He opened a laptop and began typing, his fingers moving like someone reading a score they'd already memorized 1,000 times. Employment gap, 2008 to 2018, he said, eyes on the screen. 10 years. That's unusual. Most people document everything. LinkedIn, job transitions, references. He glanced up. This woman has nothing. It's like she didn't exist. Exactly, Sterling said. Which means her credentials are questionable. Which means her medical decisions are questionable. Which means we need documentation of her instability before someone files a complaint against us. The investigator nodded and went back to typing. He didn't ask what the real issue was. He never did. The administrative hearing was convened for 1,400 hours in conference room C on the 4th floor. The room had that particular kind of silence that comes before verdicts, the kind of hush you feel in your chest before it breaks. Natalie sat alone at a long table, her scrub still wrinkled from the night shift she'd never finished. No union representative. No hospital advocate. No one had offered. Across from her sat 4 board members, including the chair, a man named Pemberton whose daughter had gotten a scholarship through Sterling's foundation connections. In the center sat Sterling himself, a folder in front of him, his expression arranged into something resembling concern. Pemberton cleared his throat. Ms. Hayes, you performed a procedure last night without explicit authorization from the attending physician. Dr. Sterling has documented concerns about the scope of your practice. He opened the folder, which contained a single fabricated write-up, pristine and typed, dated 3 days before it happened. Pemberton didn't seem to notice. We're also unable to verify your employment history prior to 2018. There are gaps that concern us. He folded his hands. Can you explain your whereabouts for the 10 years between 2008 and 2018? Natalie's jaw moved once. Her hands lay flat on the table, and they were steady, muscle memory, reflexive control, the same steadiness that had kept her hands from shaking while applying tourniquets in the dark. But the words caught somewhere in her throat like a ship running aground. I was away. Her voice was softer than it should have been. I needed time. To start over. Away where? This from a woman on the board named Chen, who barely looked up from her notes. I'm not prepared to discuss that. Sterling leaned forward slightly. His voice was gentle, almost paternal. It's important we understand your background before certifying your continued practice. Patient safety requires transparency. He said it the way a man says anything when he knows he has the room's agreement already locked down. Performing that procedure without authorization was reckless. It suggested judgment lapses. And now we discover an entire decade of unverified employment. As her supervisor, I have to recommend we take this seriously. Pemberton nodded. The other board members followed suit like ducks in formation. Your badge, please, he said. Security arrived within 8 minutes. 2 officers in grey uniforms, one carrying an empty cardboard box with a dent in the side. They walked Natalie to her locker while the break room nurses watched through the window, all of them silent, all of them still, the way people are silent when they watch someone disappear. She took down the photo from the inside of her locker first. 12 faces in helm and province, desert sun behind them, everyone squinting. She was in the center with her senior chief chevrons visible on her uniform, her arm around a lance corporal named Hendricks. Hendricks was dead now, IED in Sanjin Valley in 2011. So was Martinez. So was Peterson. So was Cole. The photo was faded like old linen, the colors bleached almost to sepia. She tucked it face down in the box. The cracked mug came next. World's okayest nurse in faded print, a joke from a Secret Santa for years ago. The succulent in a ceramic pot, dry soil, leaves the color of dried blood. 3 years she'd kept it alive, which was 3 years longer than anyone else would have bothered. A trauma shear with initials engraved in the handle, NJH. Natalie Jane Hayes. The only person who'd ever called her Jane was her mother, and her mother had been dead for 6 years. She placed these items gently, reverently, the way someone packs a coffin. The security officer reached to take the box from her, but she held it. "I can carry it," she said. They walked through the lobby at shift change, the worst possible timing, intentional or not. Peak visibility. 30 staff members moving between stations, and all of them watched. No one said anything. The automatic doors opened with a mechanical sigh, and Portland rain hit them both like a hand. The kind of rain that had weight to it, that felt personal, that soaked through scrubs in seconds and made everything feel like drowning while standing still. She stood at the bus stop 2 blocks away, cardboard box in her arms, the bottom already growing soft. Rain pooled across the cardboard in thin grey streams. The succulent tipped sideways, and the ceramic pot cracked against the box edge, spilling dark soil across the photo. She watched it happen and didn't move. A man in a suit walked past, briefcase held over his head, looked at her with a particular kind of pity that people reserve for the destroyed, and kept walking. The bus arrived at 1,447 hours. Red brake lights bloomed through the rain like flowers dying in fast motion. She didn't board. She just stood there holding the disintegrating cardboard, watching the bus pull away, water running down her face and neck in rivers. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Text from an unknown number. "Senior Chief? Is this you? It's Mitchell. I remember Afghanistan. I remember you." She looked at the words for a long time. Mitchell. That name belonged to another life, another person, another version of herself that had disappeared 10 years ago when she'd walked away from active service and buried herself in scrubs and anonymity. She let the phone go dark. The rain continued. The box continued falling apart. Behind her, through the glass windows of the bus shelter, the hospital gleamed white against grey sky, pristine and impersonal and entirely indifferent to her absence. The bus never came. 3 days passed like water through a sieve, morning to evening bleeding into the next morning without shape or distinction. Natalie's apartment was a studio in northeast Portland, 1,400 square feet of beige walls and fluorescent silence, the kind of place people move through without staying. The cardboard box sat on the kitchen counter, still deteriorating. She didn't open it again. On the 3rd day at 1,100 hours, the sound came first. A deep percussion that made the windows rattle, the unmistakable thud of helicopter rotors cutting air. Not a life flight. Something bigger. Something military. Natalie stood at the window and watched the UH-60M Black Hawk descend into Oak Creek Memorial's parking lot with the precision of a landing that had done this 1,000 times before, its olive-drab hull gleaming against Portland's grey afternoon like a promise kept. She didn't move. She watched the doors open. She watched 2 Navy officers stride across the parking lot with the gait of men who had spent 20 years learning to make doorways smaller just by walking through them. They wore dress uniforms. Ribbons across their chests. Their boots struck the pavement in synchronized rhythm, a sound like a countdown. The hospital switchboard lit up. The staff didn't know yet. But they would know. Everyone would know. By 11:15 hours, the officers had reached the main desk. "We need to speak with Senior Chief Hayes," the first officer said. Not a request. It was a command, delivered the way commands are delivered when the person issuing them has the entire weight of the Atlantic Fleet behind their voice. The receptionist's face went the color of old hospital gowns. She made a call. Then another. By 11:20 hours, they were moving through the corridors, asking questions, checking records. By 11:25 hours, the head nurse had pulled Natalie's personnel file from the archives, a file that had listed her credentials as RN, BSN, 6 years civilian experience and nothing more. What they found made them stop moving. Natalie arrived at the hospital at 1,140 hours because she couldn't not arrive. Some things have their own gravity. You can't stay away once they've started pulling. She walked through the automatic doors that had opened for her 1,000 times before, and the lobby went quiet the way rooms go quiet when they realize they've been wrong about something fundamental. The Navy officers turned. Their eyes moved over her like radar tracking a contact. One of them stepped forward, his hand extended. Senior Chief Hayes. She took the hand. She didn't speak. There was nothing to speak. The truth was in the air already, spreading like ink through water. Behind them stood Commander Mitchell. His face was creased with rain and 3 days of not sleeping. Tyler was beside him in the wheelchair, small and pale and alive because of what she'd done in the dark when no one was watching. Commander Mitchell's voice cracked like breaking ice when he spoke. Senior Chief, my son is alive because of you. He stopped there. Couldn't go further. His shoulders moved like he was carrying weight that would never be lighter. The head nurse stood frozen, Natalie's full military file open in her shaking hands. Personnel record. Security clearance summary. Medal citations. Incident reports from Helmand Province. Combat documentation. She read through the pages like someone discovering a stranger in their own home. Her face went pale with each line. This can't, I didn't, she looked at Natalie like she was seeing her for the first time. Because she was. The first SEAL officer moved to the center of the lobby. When he spoke, his voice carried with the precision of someone trained to make words travel across noise and distance and chaos. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. Reaction rippled through the assembled staff. Silver Star. The silence thickened. 2 Purple Hearts. A nurse's hand went to her mouth. And a Navy Cross. The room didn't just go quiet. It held its breath. Senior Chief Hayes saved 16 lives in Helmand Province, including Commander Mitchell's. She extracted him from a burning Humvee under fire in 2019. She performed emergency surgical procedures on 6 additional personnel using only field equipment. She maintained combat operations readiness while treating casualties with a severed brachial artery, shrapnel in her abdomen, and a concussion that should have ended her career before it began. She did not stop. She did not fail. The words hung in the fluorescent light like they'd always belonged there and everyone had just been too blind to see them. The FBI arrived at 1,215 hours. 2 agents in dark suits, moving with the efficiency of people who had done this before. They walked past all of them and headed directly to Dr. Sterling's office on the 3rd floor. Sterling had already been trying to leave. His briefcase was packed. His computer was encrypted. His files were being transferred to a secure server. The FBI agent opened his phone and showed him photographs. Bank statements. Wire transfers. 53 transfers to an offshore clinic in Costa Rica over an 18-month period. $150,000 per referral. 47 referrals. Some to patients who didn't need the procedure. Some to children whose condition Sterling had exaggerated to Commander Mitchell personally. Sterling's face went the color of someone watching their own career end in real time. The second agent spread printouts across the conference table, the same table where Sterling had fired Natalie 3 days earlier. The evidence was mathematical. Undeniable. Sterling had attempted to access military databases using the hospital's federal liaison credentials. The DoD had flagged it immediately. His medical license was being suspended pending investigation. The kickback scheme went back 47 months. $12,000 a month. $132,000 a year. Sterling's supplemental income, all of it derived from sending sick children to a facility that didn't need them. And then the hospital's board chair got a phone call from the FBI. So did the board members who had supported Sterling's termination of Natalie. They suddenly discovered urgent appointments elsewhere. Vacation obligations. Consulting contracts out of state. The board chair resigned by email from his car in the parking garage at 1,340 hours. By evening, Sterling's office was sealed with federal evidence tape. The seal looked like the close of a coffin. A junior administrator found the real disciplinary records. Natalie Hayes, 0 complaints filed against her in 6 years. Perfect medication administration record. 3 letters of commendation from families. The disciplinary write-up Sterling had created was dated the same day Commander Mitchell arrived with Tyler. The same day Sterling pitched the Costa Rica referral. The timeline made Sterling's motivation transparent the way a skeleton is transparent when you shine light through it. Natalie's competence threatened a $200,000 annual commission. Local news arrived by evening. The vans were parked outside the emergency department by 1800 hours. Prominent doctor arrested in kickback scheme. The headline was already live online before Sterling's hands were cuffed. The officers led him through the same lobby, past the same staff who had watched Natalie carry her cardboard box into the rain. His face was grey. His lawyer was speaking into a phone. His career was being dismantled in real time, layer by layer, the way buildings come apart when the foundation realizes it was built on fraud. A nurse who had left when Natalie sat down in the break room started crying at her station, no sound, just tears running down her face. The resident who had frozen during Tyler's pneumothorax whispered to no one in particular, "She tried to teach me. I didn't listen." The words were small and broken and true. Commander Mitchell gave a statement to hospital administration. The words echoed through the corridors within the hour. "You fired a decorated war hero who saved my son's life twice. Once in Afghanistan. Once in your intensive care unit. Senior Chief Hayes did her job with honor while your doctor plotted to profit from my child's suffering. I'm standing here wondering who else you failed to see. How many times did you look at people and assume their limitations instead of recognizing their capacity? How many times did you choose convenience over integrity?" The hospital CEO, arriving from vacation by helicopter, the same kind of helicopter that had brought the Navy officers that morning, asked the question everyone was thinking but afraid to voice: where is she now? They found her at a small apartment in northeast Portland, the address finally released by Naval Personnel Command. Commander Mitchell went himself. Tyler beside him in the wheelchair. Natalie opened the door in civilian clothes, her hair down, looking smaller somehow without the scrubs or the uniform that had defined her for so long. "Commander, he saluted before she could finish. She instinctively returned it, her arm moving on muscle memory that lived deeper than conscious thought, deeper than the civilian years, deeper than the attempt to disappear. Then something broke open in her chest and she leaned against the doorframe, breathing like she'd been holding it for 3 days. Tyler reached up from his chair, took her hand with fingers still small enough to hold hope. The nurse with sad eyes. "You sang to my dad." He remembered. 6 months later, on a morning when Portland finally admitted the sun existed, Natalie stood in dress whites at Oak Creek Memorial's dedication ceremony. Her senior chief chevrons were restored. Ribbons covered her chest, a Navy cross catching sunlight, bronze stars with valor arranged in ascending order, purple hearts that represented different kinds of fire. The uniform fit her like a skin she'd been shedding for 6 years and was finally ready to wear again. The new pediatric wing stood behind her, funded by a coalition of military family organizations. Bronze letters on the entrance spelled out a name, Tyler Mitchell Wing. Tyler stood at the ribbon ceremony, mobility returning after Natalie personally coordinated his care team, using every contact from 20 years in the Navy, calling in favors from SEAL teams across the country. Physicians who had served with her. Specialists who had trained under her. A network of people who understood that sometimes the quietest person in the room was the only one who could actually help. Dr. Sterling was mentioned only once during the speeches. A board member cleared her throat. "We failed to see what we should have honored. We chose the voice of authority over the evidence of competence. We will spend the rest of our tenure fixing that mistake." Sterling himself was selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table at a strip mall off 82nd Avenue, his medical career permanently over, federal restitution payments garnishing his wages for the next decade. His phone didn't ring anymore. His name didn't appear in journals. The Seattle Times had run a follow-up article. The headline was brief: "Disgraced physician rebuilds, alone." A journalist asked Natalie about Sterling now, about whether she felt vindicated. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about the cardboard box, the deteriorating photographs, the weight of carrying rage across 6 years of silence. "I hope he finds peace," she said finally. Bitterness is a heavier load than forgiveness. The SEAL team leader presented her with a challenge coin, an object no bigger than a quarter but heavy with meaning. He leaned close and whispered, "You can stop hiding now, Senior Chief." She took the coin without trembling, her hand steady, and held it like it was the world's smallest anchor. Commander Mitchell took the microphone for closing remarks. Tyler was beside him, hand on his father's arm. And Commander Mitchell's voice, when he spoke, echoed across the assembled crowd of Navy personnel, hospital staff, families, and the people who had learned that assumptions were costlier than any mistake could ever be. His final words hung in the air like they'd been waiting there all along, waiting for permission to be heard. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. And some wear both, when duty calls. Natalie stood at attention, finally visible, finally home, finally recognized. The sun caught her Navy cross and threw light across the lobby like benediction. Behind her, the hospital gleamed white and clean and entirely different from the place she had left 3 days ago in the rain. Everything had changed. And somehow, nothing had changed at all. She had always been this. They had just finally seen it. Like this video if you believe in honoring those who served. If you have military in your family, past or present, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe and let's keep going.